Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I want to tell you a story. It's not any ordinary story. It's a story about a squirrel. And not just any squirrel. This squirrel was a fireman. And I say fireman because, well, he wasn't really a man, he was a squirrel. And he wasn't really a woman, he was a squirrel. Although he might debate that with you. But Firemin Squirrel lived in a town that was known by him and all the other little animals as Moleville. Now, Moleville isn't a town as you'd think of it, really. Moleville is a secret place way off in the woods where no one can find it. In Moleville, there live moles, chipmunks, squirrels, and all sorts of little creatures. Birds, too. The birds sort of guide and keep a watch on the town and make sure no bad things come near. Anyway, back to Fireman Squirrel. There were leaders in the town. There was Mayor Mole. He made most of the decisions about what to do when a path or a road needed fixing or stuff like that, and maybe a school needed a little bit of repair or whatever. Most important decisions were up to Mayor Mole. And then there was the work department that got things done. Those were mostly chipmunks because they were fast. The work department made sure things worked like oil lamps were burning because they didn't use electricity like we do. And they also, this work department of chipmunks, they kept after the roads and the paths and what have you. And then there was another department that made things, not really in a factory as you'd think of it, but they had a bunch of little machines lining the river, and as the river water would flow by, it would turn wheels and make these little machines work. With that, they made things like their tools. Like, who knows, maybe they might need a screwdriver or something, or pliers, or who knows what, for the work department, so they could keep things fixed and in good repair. Now, Fireman Squirrel was one of the busiest of all the little animals in Moleville. If there was a fire, he was there with buckets of water, and sometimes he'd deputize other squirrels to help him put out the fire. Sometimes it would take a lot of buckets, and sometimes it would just take one if someone was just being not careful and let a little bit of fire get away out of a fireplace. Usually Fireman Squirrel handled that by himself. Anyway, Mayor Mole became concerned that Fireman Squirrel was doing all the work basically by himself. If there was something like old Mrs. Chipmunk was feeling under the weather and needed her groceries, Fireman Squirrel would get the groceries. So he did a lot of things, not just put out fires. And there wasn't really a police department. So if the chipmunks were playing games on their time off and running around too fast, Fireman Squirrel would be one of the first there to tell them they had to slow down. Anyway, Mayor Mole continued to get worried that Fireman Squirrel was doing too much. You name it, Fireman Squirrel's telephone was always ringing, and he was always answering, and he was never taking a break. One day, Mayor Mole called up Fireman Squirrel, and he said, "Fireman," he said, "I'd like to speak with you in my office," which wasn't really an office. They all lived in trees. There were little homes and offices like dug out of trees. very homely to them, and they were used to it. And it was much like any other office that we'd know. But like I said, they were built in trees. So anyway, Fireman Squirrel goes to meet Mayor Mole in his tree office. And Mayor Mole says to Fireman Squirrel, "Fireman," he says, "sit down." He said, "How many years have you been fireman in this town?" And proudly, Fireman Squirrel said, "Well, sir," he said, "I believe about 20. And Mayor Mole said, "And how many times have you taken a day off?" And Fireman Squirrel scratched his head for a second, and he said, "Well, I don't think I've taken a day off. Well, there was that one trip where I went to see my nephew across the woods." He said, "I think that was about 2 years ago." And Mayor Mole got a little bit irritated. He said, "You've taken one day off in 2 years?" And Fireman Squirrel said, "Yeah, I think so. I think that's right." And Mayor Mole says, "You've got to be tired." "No, no, no," Fireman Squirrel protested. "I'm fine." Mayor Mole said, "Squirrel, I want you to take a vacation, and I want you to take it soon." And Fireman Squirrel said, "No, no, no, I'm very busy." He said, "I can't take a vacation yet, not without a replacement, and it would take a long, long time to retrain anyone to replace me." Mayor Mole got a little more annoyed, but he said, "All right, very well, Fireman." He said, "But we'll discuss this in our next meeting." He said, "We will have a new meeting very soon." So anyway, Fireman Squirrel did have a little bit of time off, so he went back to his tree home and fixed himself a bit of dinner, some vegetables and what have you, over a little fire. And he thought they were quite good and done right. They were tasty. And unlike Fireman Squirrel, after eating, he felt a little bit tired. So he sat down on his couch and put his feet up. And unlike Fireman Squirrel, he was actually taking a nap. He had fallen asleep. Unusual for Fireman Squirrel. But there's one thing he forgot to do. He didn't put his fire out. So as he was sleeping, a little bit of flame crept out of the fireplace and caught just a bit of Fireman Squirrel's rug on his floor. It wasn't a bad fire, but it was creeping. Now, squirrels, as you know, most of them have tails, and many of them have bushy tails at that. So anyway, his tail, as he had his feet up, was kind of draped alongside him and down onto the rug. Well, the fire slowly crept, not really bad, but sort of smoldered towards Fireman Squirrel's tail. Well, all of a sudden, it caught the fur on Fireman Squirrel's tail, and his tail was on fire. Did it hurt? No, it was just the fur that was smoldering. Well, it didn't hurt yet. Then all of a sudden, you could hear it through most of Moleville. "Ouch!" screamed Fireman Squirrel. "Yow!" screamed Fireman Squirrel. "Ah!" Then all the moles and squirrels and chipmunks, they said, "What the? Something's going on in Fireman Squirrel's home." And one of them, I believe it was one of the chipmunks, quickly dialed Mayor Mole and said, "Mayor Mole, something's going on in Fireman Squirrel's home." So Mayor Mole quickly made a couple other phone calls and gathered up a crew to go up into Fireman Squirrel's home. When they got there, they found Fireman Squirrel dancing around, trying to put his tail out, which was smoldering quite nicely and perhaps stinging a bit. "That does it," said Mayor Mole. "You two," he said to a couple of chipmunks, he said, "get a couple buckets of water." So they did. The chipmunks got buckets of water and they brought him back up to the tree home. With two great big splashes, Fireman Squirrel's tail was extinguished and put out. No more fire. Then one of the other squirrels, who Mayor Mole had asked to help, grabbed one more big bucket to throw on Fireman Squirrel's fire. Splash! Out it went. Now there sat Fireman Squirrel, a little bit shaken, and kind of speechless, because that's the first time something like that had ever happened to him. He was not one to be sleeping on the job, let alone asleep while a fire was creeping around his home. Mayor Mole sat down next to him, and he said, "Fireman Squirrel, do you remember what I said to you about taking a vacation?" And Fireman Squirrel said, "Yeah, but, Mayor Mole said, "Do you remember what I said to you about being tired?" And Fireman Squirrel said, "But, he was kind of speechless because he didn't have much he could say to Mayor Mole. It would seem as if Mayor Mole, in fact, was correct. So Mayor Mole looked sternly at Fireman Squirrel and he said, "I want you to take a vacation by next week, and even sooner than that if you can." Now this kind of hurt Fireman Squirrel's pride a little bit because he was used to being the hero of the town. But he looked around and he looked at his home and he said, "This is kind of a mess," he said. "Maybe if I just asked for a little more help and didn't try to do everything myself, this wouldn't have happened." Fireman Squirrel got to thinking. Mayor Mole looked at him one more time and he said, "Fireman, do we have a deal?" Fireman Squirrel thought and he said, "Yes," he said. "Yes, Mr. Mayor, I believe we do." And about 5 days after that, with two chipmunk friends and a little boat that they had built out of tree bark, they took it and they pushed it off the riverbank. They all got in and went with the current of the river down the stream. They weren't sure where they were going, but the sun was out. The lunch they packed was good. And for the first time, Fireman Squirrel had taken a vacation. Maybe we all need vacations.